All right. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you again. So, last time we had just gotten to what seemed like a culmination of you say decades long, but the struggle for civil rights, you could say, argue, goes all the way back to 1619 when the first slaves were brought to Virginia. But really, in earnest, the full civil rights movement after decades of heartbreak and failure after the death of Reconstruction in 1877, the building of Jim Crow, the institutionalizing of that horrible institution. And it was in place and it was not questioned by most people, white or black, who were born, raised, died under that system. Most people either assumed that there was nothing wrong with it, or if there was something wrong with it, it was never going to change. It was just so entrenched in society. Just like we look at so many things that wish we could change today about American society, and it's like, well, they're so entrenched. How do you get rid of it? Starting in 1955 with the murder of Emmett Till, the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and the Montgomery bus boycotts all happening within about a year of each other, 54, 55. Then you have in the summer of 1964, in July, you have the Civil Rights Act passing under Lyndon Johnson with great speed. It was pretty shocking. He takes over in November of 63 after the assassination of Kennedy, and within 8 months, he's passed the most consequential civil rights act, not only in American history, but in world history, that actually had some tangible, huge benefits on the ground. It's one of the greatest pieces of legislation ever. It made us nearly a full democracy. Remember that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, that's kind of one tool in the civil rights movement's, toolbox, so to speak. We had forgotten about it for so long. Essentially, this clause says that states can't discriminate based on race. We just ignored that for several decades. We had this Plessy v. Ferguson decision that said, sure, you can't treat the races different. You can separate them as long as the facilities are equal. And that was a loophole that opened the door to segregating everything, as we said last time, from birth in different hospitals to death in separate cemeteries. Blacks and whites were separate. I didn't really get into this last time, but going back to Jim Crow, I think I mentioned it. It's kind of odd how the South was so explicitly rigid in how, like, you go here, you go here. And blacks and whites did live separate lives, but at the end of the day, African Americans in very intimate ways lived in white people's homes. One of the most incredible moments in my life is when my grandmother died a couple years ago, and my mother's mother, and I was helping my mom clean out her room um, at the assisted living center that she was in, and we looked through all her old photos, photos of her and her girlfriends when they came out to Santa Monica in 1942, all kinds of cool old pictures when she was, just 22 years old and got married. Um, but the one that impressed me the most was a picture of my mother as an infant, 1947, on one of these trips to Mississippi. Now, my mother was born in Missouri. She eventually, when she was a young girl, she was about 8, 9 years old when her family moved out to California. But my grandmother had family in Mississippi, so they'd, travel every summer pretty much and visit her sister and her brother who still lived there. And they would live their whole lives and eventually die in Mississippi. And in one of these pictures, my grandmother is in her mid 20s. My mother is an infant. It's 1947. And there's a black woman who's holding my infant mother. And I asked my mother, I said, who is that woman? And she said, oh, that was Mammy. Now, if you guys don't know, Mammy is a title basically given to a black woman in that era who was sort of a maid nanny. I guess that's the fusion of the terms. Most middle class and upper class white folks had a black maid who cleaned the house, raised the children, and did all that kind of stuff. Now, this is long after slavery's dead and died away. These women were not slaves; they were paid domestic servants essentially, but it was exclusively for black women. White women did not do these jobs in the South. and the pay was very low, and they were, not subject to minimum wage or social security or anything like that. And so I was shocked at this picture, and so I asked my mother. I said, "What's her story? Mammy is not a name. What was this woman's name?" And so my mother did some research and asked around to all her relatives and found the whole backstory of this woman. And I come to find that my grandmother's mother was very ill for several years, and this Black woman lived in the home and helped raise my grandmother's younger siblings and took care of her mother for years, lived in the home, used the same toilet, ate at the same dinner table. So there's a rather weird separation when it came to meeting as equals, so to speak, right? Like a Black man and a white woman could never meet in public as equals in any setting, not at church, not at a store, nothing like that. But you could have, as a white woman, a Black man come into your home if he was fixing up something, right? If you're in a superior inferior relationship, the separateness can go by the wayside. So it's very complex, and we don't even have all time to get into all the inner workings of how, the Jim Crow system worked. But nonetheless, segregation by the state could be attacked by the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. We ignored it for decades, and finally we said, Plessy v. Ferguson doesn't make sense. If you separate everything and everybody, by definition, you're not treating them equal. And so you could now one by one attack those institutions. And that's what was going on with the schools and the public swimming pools and the libraries and all that. But what about the businesses, right? This is where the Civil Rights Act comes in. It outlawed discrimination in both sides of the private sector, your right to be a customer and your right to be an employee. And also mixed in there is, Title VI, which we said last time goes to nonprofits. So the churches, the charities, and the private universities, which aren't businesses, so they wouldn't be affected by Title II or Title VII, but could discriminate, and several did. What a lot of these universities did is they said, well, our state-run university, Ole Miss, whatever, is not able to discriminate. So if you still want to go to an all-white institution, go to one of these private universities in Virginia or Mississippi. And that lasted for, several years into the 60s before the Civil Rights Act came out, and that got rid of that too. So this was a tremendous, wonderful law. The one thing it was lacking was voting rights. There was nothing in the Civil Rights Act about voting. They just didn't have the votes for it yet. So in the summer of 1964, there was a huge movement of young people who descended on Mississippi. The civil rights movement decided to kind of switch gears here because all of those segregation signs and everything, all that came down in the summer of 64. All of that formal segregation ended, but voting did not yet get to equality. Now, in Mississippi, which was the worst of the worst in terms of segregation, it was the poorest state. It was the most backward state. African Americans were 42% of the population, but fewer than 5% of them could vote because of the poll taxes, literacy tests, all that was still there in the South at that particular time. And so the idea was that liberal whites would join these organizations, civil rights organizations, go on down South with, African Americans as well from the North, and they would build freedom schools, right? You can't pass the literacy test because you're not able to read and because your state built you awful schools. We're going to build you freedom schools where we'll educate all the, kids in this neighborhood for free. We will raise money and pay the poll tax for you. And we're going to accompany you down to the voter registrar's office so that you don't get threatened or lynched, and we're going to help you out there. Now, all of this was wonderful social justice activism. But Martin Luther King, after Freedom Summer, after a whole summer of this, with the Klan threatening them and burning crosses and even murdering quite a few people, still the statistics showed that it would take over 100 years to register every last African American in the state of Mississippi at the rate that they were going. The Jim Crow system was just too entrenched. It was ridiculous. A lot of these states like Alabama and Mississippi, they had these laws that said, you have to register in the month of January only. The other 11 months of the year, you couldn't register to vote. So you got to do it in January when you're not thinking about an election in November, when it seems very abstract, right? Voting 10 months later. You had to go down to the voter registrar's office, which was closed on weekends and usually opened at about 10 in the morning, closed from noon to 2 for lunch, and then was open from like 2 to 4. So there was really just like 4 hours in the day. 10 hours in a week where you could go and do it. And they often, would just slam that, door shut in your face. And it didn't matter if there were 500 people in line, they'd maybe help two or three out. They just made the process so cumbersome, it was ridiculous, right? Remember, nothing in the laws themselves said Black people can't vote. They just had all these ridiculous restrictions that were not applied equally across the board. Or in some cases, they were, and most white people in the state couldn't vote. So something had to change, especially when another series of murders really galvanizes the population of America. There were three young men. There were one Black, two white, and they were down there, Freedom Summer, helping out these freedom schools. And a sheriff and his deputy and another man decided that they were just going to send a message, and they pulled them over, or detained them for the evening, and then after letting them go, decided to murder them and cover it up and act like these guys just sort of ran away. When their bodies were found, there was a huge uproar that the federal government needed to protect its citizens in the state of Mississippi, that you should be able to be a troublemaker and go down to Mississippi and open these freedom schools. And hey, some people may not like it there, but you shouldn't be able to be murdered and then, the government there just sweeps it under the rug. And so it was very clear after this, the northern population, which had been very apathetic for decades about this, like, we don't want to fight Reconstruction again. Now they said, I'm sick and tired of this because it's on my TV all day long, all the time. I'm embarrassed for my country. I don't like how we look to the world. I want to win the Cold War. That was a huge part of this, was that in the 60s, Africa was decolonizing. The Brits, the Belgians, the French, everybody was going home. And there were these new free and independent Black nations, the first time in 100 years. And you got two countries that are vying for their loyalty. You got the Soviet Union that can easily point at America and say, hey, turn on your television if you think America's the land of opportunity. You see how Black people are murdered in that country and the government does nothing? You don't want to be on the America side. You want to be on the side of the Soviet Union. And so each president since Truman basically said, we are going to lose this Cold War. All of Africa and Asia, for that matter, and maybe even Latin America, is going to go communist because of our horrible record on race. The Soviets will use that against us. And so this was a huge push by even conservatives to say, well, we don't want to lose the Cold War. We need to stop all this stuff. Understand that there were a lot of just apathetic people in America. There were a lot of white people that were not racist, did not like Jim Crow, but they just sort of said, well, I don't want the federal government having all this authority, or there's nothing we can do. We tried this before. And now it was just a new world. We were carrying the torch of liberty, freedom, equality. And this was, by any standard, anyone could look at it and say, this is just terrible. And it made a mockery of our so-called democratic system. So Lyndon Johnson went back to both parties and said, we got to pass voting rights. We got to do it. One last big push would, from the ground up, from the civil rights groups, would finally give him the energy to do this. Although a new constitutional amendment was passed that year in 1964, the 24th Amendment, it ended the poll tax explicitly. It said you cannot make people pay a fee in order to vote, that it was a right. Remember that voting doesn't actually show up in the Constitution anywhere. It just says states handle voting and they come up with their requirements. And then we have these regulations, like the 15th Amendment passed in 1870 that says, okay, states do what you want, but you can't deny someone the right to vote because they're Black, right? You can do it because of gender until 1920, until the 19th Amendment. And then we say, okay, it can't be based on gender either. But states still come up. You see these big fights with the Georgia law that was just passed, right? States can make their regulations, their ID requirements, early voting, the date, time, manner, all of that stuff. There's a lot of wiggle room there. But now they couldn't explicitly say you have to pay a tax in order to vote, that you could have whatever other restrictions you wanted, but not a tax. So all the southern states said, all right, there won't be a tax, but we're still going to have early voting or early registration, all these other restrictions. So it wasn't enough. We needed a proactive law that they could not adapt to, right? Meaning you could pass one restriction and say, okay, well, you can't do X. And they'll just say, well, we'll do Y and Z still. We'll adapt and still restrict. A voting rights law that proactively said you can't pass any new restrictions unless they've been cleared with federal court, that's going to make a huge difference. They weren't quite there yet in terms of having the political will to do it, but in early 65, we get that. Number one, Martin Luther King decided to make a huge issue of this. He knew that Birmingham and the aftermath there led directly to the Civil Rights Act being passed. He felt we needed one big march that got national attention, uh, huge press media coverage, and the federal government would intervene yet again. So it's very poignant. The civil rights movement really starts in Alabama, in Montgomery, which is very important. If you guys have forgotten, the Confederate States of America, before Virginia seceded after Fort Sumter, Alabama had the capital of the Confederacy, and it was in Montgomery, Alabama. So Montgomery is always called the cradle of the Confederacy. We were the first capital of it. And now this is where Jim Crow is being torn down. So it's rather beautiful, elegant. And this is where the civil rights movement would basically end and peter out. It starts with Rosa Parks in 1955, and it really ends with the March on Selma in March of 65. So what Martin Luther King was going to do was bring his groups, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, down to Alabama and have a march from Selma to Montgomery, right? So it would be a full loop. We started in Montgomery 10 years ago. We're going to end in Montgomery. Montgomery was the capital. It was going to be this 100-mile march where thousands of people are marching, black and white, side by side, hand in hand. And then when they got to the Capitol, they were going to nail all these complaints to the door of Governor Wallace there, almost like Martin Luther King Jr.'s namesake, Martin Luther, when he nailed up his 95 Theses to the door of Wittgenstein Cathedral. Similarly here, this was going to be Martin Luther King saying, we want all these voter restriction laws done away with, Governor Wallace. Well, the march, in a way, failed at the outset, but succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, meaning at Selma, these groups were going to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and start out on the main highway to march to the Capitol, and they could not even get out of Selma. They started marching. The National Guard, mounted on horseback, told them, you don't have a permit, because they were denied a permit to march, because it was a Black Civil Rights March. And the media was all there. And live on TV, again, we see these acts of brutality, the Alabama National Guard literally steamrolling over people on horseback, trampling people, and then dismounting. And you saw this bloody mess here with tear gas wafting in the breeze. You had National Guardsmen beating people with billy clubs. And again, each of the civil rights workers was trained under no circumstances to fight back. You just go limp, you just sit there, so that the pictures and the media that's captured, there's no way to argue it where you say, well, this person was resisting, they were being violent, and the police had to escalate. No, in this situation, all of the pictures will be unambiguous that the police and the National Guard are an engine of oppression, and these poor Black people are just trying to exercise their civil rights as Americans, and they were brutalized. And it would all be caught on TV, and it would be a national disgrace and embarrassment. And it played out that way entirely. It was savage, it was brutal. And just this past year, this tragic death of this, huge lion of American history, John Lewis, who had been a congressman from Alabama for years. This is a wonderful story of a young man who was a college-age kid in 1965. He was one of the leaders in the student movement in SNCC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Alabama was his home state, and he helped lead these marches. He was brutalized, and in just a few years' time, after the Voting Rights Act was passed and Black people could vote in Alabama, they voted him in his district, and he remained a congressman until his death last year at the age of 80 years old. He died. I believe they renamed the Edmund Pettus Bridge after him. They call it now the John Lewis Bridge, and there was a huge ceremony there. You guys probably witnessed it. You saw it. And now there's legislation in the Congress called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that would further, expand the franchise in states. If you guys don't know, there's a big battle over this in Georgia. Several conservatives arguing that the integrity of the vote's more important. They want more restrictions, voter ID, stuff like that. And liberals tend to want to say, well, let's just expand the franchise. Any restriction whatsoever is going to depress voter turnout. This is a democracy. We want to increase it. And so these battles are still being fought to this day. But this protest galvanized the country because, yet again, white folks in the Midwest and Kansas and Nebraska, who had probably never seen a Black person in their lives, turned on the television, saw this, and got really irritated by this, called their congressman, called their senator, flooded the White House with telegrams saying, do something about this, because this is truly upsetting that this is happening in America. It looks like someplace far off, like what the communists do in Czechoslovakia, or what the white racist minority does in South Africa to the Black majority population. This is embarrassing and it's scandalous. Do something about it. So Lyndon Johnson called the governor and said, you have to do something. You've given me no choice. I'm going to nationalize the National Guard. That is, the National Guard's like the military of each state, but in emergencies, presidents can federalize it, basically, take it over and make them stand down, which he did. Johnson finally said, the Alabama National Guard is standing down, and in fact, they're going to escort the marchers going forward. Tens of thousands of civil rights demonstrators, celebrities from Hollywood came and marched with white churches from the North, Unitarian churches with Black civil rights leaders. That was the pinnacle of the civil rights movement, when really the whitest swath majority of Americans bought into it and believed this was the time, this was the place, this was the cause. It was huge celebration. And in just a few months, another Civil Rights Act was passed called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So what is in the Voting Rights Act of 65? Well, essentially what it does, like I said, it puts the ball in the court of the states, because this was always a problem. You could say, all right, you can't restrict the right to vote to Black men. And then, of course, they'll just say, all right, well, it's not denying it to Black men, it's denying it to any person who can't read or pass a literacy test or come up with the $5. And it was just this never-ending chase. You pass a regulation that strikes down state laws, and they just come up with new ones. And so this put the ball in the court of the states, basically saying, all those restrictions are struck down. Basically, any law of the state that seems to depress voter turnout, the federal government is going to come to your state. And we're going to look at these restrictions. And you can't pass any new laws unless you clear it. You have to pre-clear every election law that you ever pass with the federal government. And if we determine that it's unfair, that it's going to depress voter turnout, that's it. You're done. And the proof of this is in the data and the evidence. It's extraordinary that statistic I showed you earlier, only 5% of Black Mississippians could vote in 1964. By 1970, just 6 years later, nearly 60%, 59% were voting in that election. Now, you might say, well, that's still not great, 59%. That's about what the white population is. There's at least equality there. Is it good enough? Well, I am a firm believer that if we are a democracy, we need to have 85%, 90% voter turnout. You know, you can't really be a true democracy if your voter turnout's 3%. And even 59% to me is a bit low. But you know what? That's America, and we are, co-equal across the board now. It's rather extraordinary. African Americans in the South today vote in terms like a percentage higher than African Americans in San Francisco or New York, which are supposedly the most liberal cities in America. So the Voting Rights Act was a huge success. It doesn't fix every problem because there's still racial gerrymandering and things like that. But what happened was, white governors could not just go around saying, we want to segregate, we want to do this, we want Jim Crow back, because guess what? 42% of your state is Black, and you're going to lose the governorship if you don't at least get some Black people to vote for you. And so this changed everything. There's now going to be Black sheriffs, Black mayors, Black, city council members, congressmen, et cetera, et cetera. It would change the South and America forever. It was an extraordinary law. Now, unfortunately, the Supreme Court did start to restrict this later, just in the last 7-8 years. Much of the voting rights pre-clearance acts were struck down. The Supreme Court basically argued that America is no longer a racist country, that these southern states are no more racist than any others, and that they didn't have to pre-clear anymore, which I got to tell you, just from a legal standpoint, whatever you think about racism in America, I've never seen that before. And again, I have a little bit of experience here. I do have a degree in American constitutional law. I've never heard of a statute being ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court just because it's improper and unnecessary anymore. That's not your job. Your job is to see, is it in conflict with the Constitution? And if it was constitutional when it passed, and it was ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court in 65, how could you rule it unconstitutional later? Not because it violates any clause in the Constitution, but just the Supreme Court basically was substituting its wisdom for the legislature, basically arguing, well, it's not essential anymore. We doubt that you need this. It's not the job of the Supreme Court to say that. So I disagreed with that decision. And we'll see if the John Lewis Voting Rights Act bill gets passed. But nonetheless, this law was hugely important, and it vastly changed America forever, for the better. Everything's not all great, though, at the same time. The same week that the Voting Rights Act passed, and white America basically said, well, that's it. We're done. We've got full equality. We've got the Civil Rights Act. We got the Voting Rights Act. In every way under the sun, the law now is colorblind in America. Aren't we the best country ever? That week, Watts erupted in the biggest riot of the 20th century up to that point. It was a horrible display, and it left America very divided. So here's basically the facts. As you might imagine, there was a black motorist who was pulled over by police, roughed up in front of a large crowd. And the black population of Watts was rather irritated with that because they had lived that existence for decades. And they started turning over police cars, breaking windows, burning down buildings. And the media, of course, covered it all. And white America was kind of confused. They just sort of said, greatest success ever in the history of civil rights. And at the same time, black people in the North, not in the South, are angry and rebelling and rioting. What's the discrepancy here? We don't understand. Well, here was the discrepancy. Watts, and again, LA was city of the future. It was one of the wealthiest cities on earth, and African Americans living there were doing better than African Americans anywhere on the planet. Yet there was still huge gaps between African Americans in Los Angeles and whites. LA was a segregated town, folks. You guys well know. Rich white folks live in Bel Air and Brentwood and Beverly Hills. Poor black folks live in South Central and Compton and Watts. And there were no laws that said you had to do that, but these housing regulations basically did it. And so what do we know about, places like Watts? Well, there was no hospital in the entire city of Watts. There were hundreds of thousands of African Americans who lived there. And imagine you're having a heart attack. You got to go to the hospital. There's no hospital there. Most black residents of Watts did not own their own cars, so they got to ride the bus. The bus service was slow and it was inadequate. The schools were falling apart. The police department, of course, you guys think that police have a problem today. It was far worse in the 1960s, far, far worse, before everyone had camera phones that were recording what the police were doing. The police didn't even apologize for this stuff. And honestly, the ones in LA were probably the best in the country because it was the rural areas that were the really bad ones where there was no press attention or anything. Cops couldn't even be bothered with catching criminals. They were too busy taking bribes and shaking down local citizens. In the big metropolitan areas, they at least were a bit honest. There was a daily newspaper that would expose certain scandals, but racism was rampant. There hardly any black people on the LAPD. And this is not a city in Selma, Alabama. There were some African-American cops, but not many. So imagine the message that sends to the black population of Watts, that the law and order, the entire authority, and the teachers too, are white folks that don't live into your community. They come there when, the sun comes up. They leave when the sun comes down. They brutalize you. They can get away with doing anything. And you start to see it as a foreign occupying force, basically. You don't respect it. You say, you don't respect us, we don't respect you. There was a toxic relationship there. So for all these reasons, Watts erupted. And then all the other cities erupted. Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, Michigan, Harlem, New York, one after the other. Every black neighborhood, black ghetto in the country erupted in the mid-60s, between 1965 and 1968. Sometimes it was an annual thing. I think Detroit had a riot every summer in 1966, 67, 68. And it almost seemed to white folks like this was sort of an organized rebellion because it was happening everywhere. It was not. What it demonstrated was that the conditions in every city in America were the same, which showed you that racism was, fairly uniform. It had different flavors, it had different aspects to it, But at the end of the day, the North was, although better than the South, it was still unequal between the Black and white population. Detroit and LA were richer than, Selma or Montgomery, but still you had this disparity. The white population enjoyed all of the benefits of society. The Black population deserved none of it, basically, or got none of it, I should say. Certainly deserved it. And so this drove a wedge between the two. Without moderate white support, you were not going to have success here. And you see that this was kind of played out last summer, right? Where the Black Lives Matter movement came out and protested, and there were lots of warnings. Don't get violent, because this is not going to serve our cause. And all it's going to do is drive all these moderate whites out of our ranks, and they'll join conservatives who will not want to move forward with civil rights anymore. And largely that did decrease some of the success of the movement. Although it certainly wasn't anywhere near as violent as what happened in the 60s. Those were movements that were very, very violent. Lots of deaths, lots of buildings burning down. When you compare like the number of people who protested in March last summer with how much chaos and destruction there was, it was actually pretty minimal for the size of it, right? Like, this is the largest protest movement in human history. And you go, well, okay, it went way too far in certain areas. But when you actually look at the scope, it was not anywhere near what we dealt with in the 60s. And we got through that as well. So we're now in an era where most African Americans would say, well, we've just got started. 2 civil rights bills, we need much more done. We've been waiting 100 years after slavery ended to get full equality, and there's so much more progress. And most whites said, hey, we're done with this. We don't want to do this anymore. Still a lot of areas of American life that we didn't address yet, like housing, right? Is it the right of white people to bind together in a certain neighborhood and say, we don't want Black people in this neighborhood, and we want everyone to sign a contract, and we won't sell to you unless you sign the contract. And once you do, you can't rent or sell to Black people. Most white people in the 60s agreed, I think Black people should vote. I don't think they should be denied access to schools, but I don't want to live next to them. And I think I should have the right to do it. In 1965, still most white people didn't want to rock the boat with housing. In fact, in 1966, the year after Selma, people forget this, Martin Luther King went to Chicago. He went to Cicero. Now, if you guys don't know Chicago, Cicero is a little suburb. It's not that nice of an area, but it's all white. It's Italian. Hence, it's named after an Italian guy, Cicero, a Roman. Hundreds of thousands of Black people worked in Cicero every day, cleaning white people's homes, working in factories, sweeping the floor, doing things like that. But none of them lived there. You could not live there. And you did not want to get caught in Cicero after dark, because this is the myth about the North. Well, we're not racist. Sure they are. Of course they are. And some of the worst perpetrators of the racism were what used to be called white ethnic people, right? Irish Catholic, Italian Catholic. A lot of those groups, far more racist than, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, who by this time were basically saying, yeah, we've ditched racism 20 years ago when Watson and Crick discovered DNA, and we knew there was no biological standard for race. Working class whites didn't get that memo until, much, much later. And so they still were marching and protesting. Martin Luther King was savagely beaten and attacked in the North because of this, because he was marching through Cicero saying, we have the right to live here. We're Americans just like you. And this again drove a wedge between the two. Moderate whites just said, well, this is too far for us. We don't want to go along with this. This is really an amazing thing to me, that it's universal in America that we celebrate Martin Luther King. But if you see a lot of the celebrations, it's Martin Luther King, 1955 to 1965. People forget that he demonstrated against the Vietnam War, that he tried to integrate the North, and most whites didn't want to go along with that. And he was a divisive figure in his last few years of life. But he's since become a martyr and, beyond reproach. But at the time, half of America hated him. Even Northerners just said, oh, he's gone too far. He wants to integrate the North. And again, this is where the movement really peters out, because Northern whites basically said, we think the South should be racist like we are, where we basically don't say it in the laws, but how we live basically is a very segregated society. And so it's very sad, but the movement largely peters out there. In 1968, Martin Luther King was in Memphis, helping the sanitation workers, the garbage workers there, who were mostly black and very underpaid and not treated well on the job. He was organizing a march and a demonstration there where he was shot and killed by a white racist, James Earl Ray. And it really shook the country. There were riots and rebellions in over 100 cities that next day. He was shot and killed on April 4th, and the next day, over 100 cities in America erupted. The one in Washington, D.C. was really bad. You could see the flames all over the city from our nation's capital. And because of the fear on the part of white America, finally laws were passed that integrated housing. But it was almost like too little too late. Most of those programs would be cut back in the 70s and 80s, right? Where, we had greenlining, like let's get some federal money into these suburban neighborhoods. There was kind of a retreat away from that. Now that you couldn't discriminate anymore and make people sign these housing covenants, the suburbs don't really become integrated. They're becoming more so today, but this is how America is segregated now. The laws don't say that Compton is a black neighborhood and Los Al is a white neighborhood, but effectively they are, essentially because people have freedom of movement and move one where they want to move and live where they want to live. And it's created this, society that still to this day is very segregated. Now, we've made tremendous progress. We've done, wonderful things. There's two laws, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, were tremendous. But it was almost like we got success right after the murder of Martin Luther King. We finally passed our last Civil Rights Act in '68 that said no longer can housing be discriminatory, no more covenants, no more things like that. HOAs can't do that. Black people have the right to live wherever they want. And this changed a lot. You guys may not know this, but the whole Inland Empire was all white before 1968. Upland, Ontario, Victorville, Riverside, all those areas were 100% white. And after those laws are passed that ban discrimination, African Americans are free to move into those neighborhoods, and they do, which is great and wonderful. You should be able to do that. But it was almost like too little too late. It was at the very end of this movement where the Great Society was basically sputtering out. We weren't as generous with our federal money, and the rise of Ronald Reagan and the conservative movement of the 70s and 80s would start to cut back on that. And moderate America would now say, I think we're spending too much on welfare programs for the poor and housing and all that stuff. Let's retreat. Because unfortunately, a lot of Black folks were starting to get those benefits now. And so most moderate whites just said, well, we're not sure if this is money well spent. So that would kind of, sputter out the movement there. So the movement never dies. It's going to continue, but it's no longer going to have tremendous bipartisan support and national support across the board. And we're going to get in arguments now about what really is racism, right? Undoubtedly, if you look at America today, the statistics are shocking, especially when you look at things like income and wealth. Like I was reading the other day that for every $100 of wealth that a white family has, African Americans have $8 or $9 of wealth, right? Wealth meaning not your income, but like what you have in assets, like your home, your retirement, things like that. Tremendous wealth disparities. Now, there's no laws that prevent a Black person from getting a job, or moving up the social ladder and economic ladder like anybody else. But it seems like these problems are systemic. The system produces it despite the result, the actual laws that are on the books, and the very good, liberals that run a lot of these programs, right? If you look at Long Beach Unified School District, there's still these huge gaps in grades and in access and all of these things, yet the entire district is run by very liberal people who are very well-meaning and want to close those gaps. So why do they persist? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. And it's, unfortunately, above my pay grade where I don't really have the answers or anything, but there's where we are today. And we're passing the torch now to you, the younger generation, to kind of deal with this issue that is the perennial issue in American society. And hopefully you guys can get us there to the promised land. Okay, well, that's enough of that. We're done with the civil rights movement for now. We'll touch on it a bit when we do the 60s and 70s, and we'll do sort of the end of the movement, right? The divisive part. After 1965, you get the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam and these more radical groups that really turn off white America. And we'll talk about that a bit more. But mostly I wanted to go over the story of how we got these amazing two laws that are going to destroy and break the back of formal legal discrimination in America. We have come a long way, and we have to appreciate that, and we do have to celebrate that. Doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels and we don't have more progress to make, but we do need to celebrate that we took a good look at ourselves and we did reform and we did make huge progress. So there's where we are. We'll do the 1960s next time. Good to be with you. All right.